I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars. And of course, the NAS also sponsors this webinar series, as well as many others. Today's guest, excuse me, is Professor Terence Kealey, and our topic today is going to be the rather controversial, but I think eminently sensible case against public science. That is the title of what we're going to be discussing today. Let me tell you a little bit more about Terence Kealey. He's a biochemist by profession. He trained in medicine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London and graduated with a PhD from Oxford University. Once there, he stayed on to become a Wellcome Senior Research Fellow in Clinical Science. So that's quite a prestigious appointment. And from 2001 until 2014, Terence served as the Vice Chancellor, that's the equivalent of the university president here, of the University of Buckingham, which bills itself as the only private university in the UK. And that's something that I learned and didn't know about. But the point is that he is someone who knows of what he speaks when we talk about how science is organized and how it's funded and how it fits into the university. While he was at Oxford, Terence Kealey became interested in the sociology and economics of modern science, and this resulted in a thought-provoking book he published in 1996 called The Economic Laws of Scientific Research. And there he came to the rather startling conclusion that public funding of science probably did more net harm than good. And he updated that message in 2008 in his revised version of this, titled Sex, Science, and Profits: How People Evolved to Make Money. And that new title had to have helped sales. I'm sure we'll hear some more about that momentarily. Terence has also authored numerous articles on the theme of how we fund science and what role public funding versus private funding has to say on this. And I'm going to momentarily post links to several of his articles in the chat box, along with a link to his profile page at the Cato Institute. He captured my attention with a very provocative essay, which is the title for today's webinar, entitled The Case Against Public Science. And this was published as one of the Cato Institute's Cato Unbound series, titled Who Pays for Science? Before we get to our conversation, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Terence and I will be having a conversation for about 45 minutes or so. And at that point, we're going to be opening the floor to questions from you, the audience. Now, you can put those in any time that you like. You don't have to wait until we're done talking. We'd prefer it if you could put those questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Either is fine, but the Q&A box is a little bit more interactive. And as I said, you can do this at any time during our conversation. You don't have to wait until we open things up for questions. So, Terence Kealey, sorry. Welcome to Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So, the case against public science, this is something that is sure to set most academics' hair on fire, because it seems to go right to the radical heart of what it means to do science. And of course, the basic idea that I think motivates that is that the only body that can fund science is the government, and it's the government rather than the private sector, because the presumption is that science is a public good. And but you say no. You say that there's a case against that. So why don't we just start there?
Well, there's a very strong case, and the fact that academics get outraged is neither here nor there. I mean, if you'd gone back to ancient Egypt and told the priests that they didn't need to build pyramids, or you went back to medieval France and told the priests they didn't need to build those Gothic cathedrals, each of which consumed vast tracts of GDP per capita, they also would have been outraged, but that didn't necessarily make them right. The United States of America is the most interesting example of why and illustrates why, in fact, we don't need to fund science publicly. So the United States of America was completely laissez-faire in science until as late as 1940. It's one of the great natural experiments. So Britain was always laissez-faire in science throughout the whole of the Industrial Revolution because we followed the teachings of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith said, governments don't need to fund science. And then when the United States of America took over from Britain as the world's lead nation industrially in about 1890, the United States continued not to fund science publicly. And you have this very interesting period between 1890 and 1940, a 50-year period when the United States of America is the richest country in the world and gets richer all the time. No public funding of science, just like Britain in the Industrial Revolution before it. Interestingly, France and the German states do have very generous government funding for science, but they never even catch up with the British, let alone do what the Americans did, overtake. So the first historical piece of evidence we have to suggest that governments don't need to fund science is, quite frankly, 200 years of English-speaking history. The world's richest country in the 19th century was Britain, the world's richest country in the 20th century was the United States of America, and neither government funded science. That's a good start to a conversation, I think.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of scientists don't have a historical appreciation that you've just outlined. You know, the massive public funding and investment, as they like to call it, in science really began here in this country in the 1950s, when, of course, the National Science Foundation was established, and you know, there was some very interesting debate about establishing the National Science Foundation, tied in with just this very thing, you know, who should fund science. And of course, you know, you mentioned at the end of the 19th century, of course, that was a time of tremendous technical innovation and actually scientific innovation. You know, I'm thinking of course, the technical innovation being the proliferation of things like radio, you know, telephony, other kinds of technical innovations. But certainly in the case of the pure sciences, you know, just incredible innovation, and none of it was actually public funded. And of course, when you come into the 20th century, you know, you look at things like, well, what are the greatest inventions of the 20th century? And I would say one is the transistor, the other is the polymerase chain reaction, and the third is CRISPR, you know, and that gene editing technology. And of those three, two were funded entirely by the private sector, and one, CRISPR, that was publicly funded science, but the actual development of CRISPR was a kind of accidental emergence from basic science that was funded by the government. And so the record of public funding of science seems to not be very good, and yet we increase the amount of money. I mean, it's an exponential increase. It doubles roughly every 7 years, and of course has been doubling even more now. And in the UK, did you have a similar kind of arc where, you know, you mentioned that during the Industrial Revolution, that was a major funder or major driver of innovation. And of course, I'm thinking of, you know, people like the members of the Lunar Society, you know, those kinds of people that attracted James Watt and a whole bunch of Faraday and a number of other scientists. But what was the arc in the UK around the transition from between the wars to the modern system after the wars? Did the UK experience a similar kind of exponential increase of science funding, and did that result in any better record of innovation?
Well, just to come back to the American example before coming to the British example, because they're both the same story. So yeah. The American government doesn't fund science, period, until the Second World War, of course. And in 1940, you get the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which funds the Manhattan Project and other fantastic projects. And the American government funds some fantastic science between 1940 and 1945. But what happens in 1945 is it's made very clear to Vannevar Bush, who runs these programs, that with the advent of peace That's it. You can go back to the peacetime settlement where the government doesn't fund science. Vannevar Bush got very upset about this, and he wanted to keep on living off the government's money. He wrote a book, Science, the Endless Frontier, and he did everything he could to persuade the federal government to carry on funding the OSRD, to no avail, and the OSRD fails and closes in 1947. And that's it. There is no American government funding of science. A bill for the National Science Foundation goes through both houses of Congress. Truman vetoes it in 1947 because he doesn't believe that government should fund science. And it only changes in 1950 when Truman publishes his doctrine, and it becomes very clear that a new war is descending on America, the Cold War. And so they create the National Science Foundation, not actually to do science, but to train scientists in the event of another hot war breaking out, needing all those scientists. But it's very modest, the funding, $1.5 million or something for research in 1950. And all that continues in a very uninteresting way until 1957. What stimulates the federal government in America to fund science in a big way is Sputnik. Sputnik triggered an incredible panic in America. It's hard to look back at it now. But in 1957, everyone thought that Russia was going to nuke America from space. And it caused deep, deep distress in America. And in 1958, a huge, gargantuan explosion of government funding for science happens. You create new agencies such as ARPA, later DARPA. You create new agencies such as NASA, and you create huge funding for the NSF and actually for the universities. And all this is designed to catch up with the Soviet Union. But if you look at GDP per capita, you see absolutely no impact at all on this vast expansion of the government funding for science. Britain is exactly the same story, but it's just earlier. It's the First World War that changes everything. So we have no government funding for science until actually technically 1913. But it's the First World War, which for us in Britain was the major event of the 20th century. For you, it's much more the Second World War. And then you get the government funding of science. And the irony is that the model that the British model themselves on in 1914 to 1918 is Germany, which of course loses the war. The model that America models itself on, the NSF and all that, is the Soviet Union, which absolutely loses the peace. And so you get this extraordinary situation where first Britain and then America have these huge expansions for science, and then actually quite a lot of retrenchment. In fact, there's a lot of retrenching in America, particularly at R&D. R&D is a wider thing than science. But the government, in 1966, the American government, the federal government in America in 1966 was funding not only 3/4 of all pure science, it was funding 2/3 of all research and development. In 1966, if you were a company wanting to do research and development, you wrote a grant as if you were a charity and the federal government funded it. That's all gone away now, but that shows how much the federal government was committed to funding science. And it's all because of terror that the Russians are going to overtake America, just as we in Britain were terrified that the Germans were going to overtake us. A really important thing about all these huge expansions of funding and the fact that in America you converted the universities completely from institutions of teaching and learning to research institutions which do a bit of teaching and learning on the side. None of that has had any impact at all on rates of economic growth. And therefore, that has to raise fundamental questions. Why is the American taxpayer being stung for all this money when the American taxpayer benefits not one whit in terms of long-term rates of economic growth?
There's been there is a lot of it seems to me propaganda about the role that in public investment in science does, and of course, predictably, you see things coming out of the space program, for example. It's always Velcro, and relatively little else, and I've also seen some figures or some studies, the term loosely applied, where people try to calculate the return on investment of science, and you're talking about returns on investment claimed to be between 20 and 25%, and that's even beyond what Bernie Madoff was promising on his investments, again, really loosely, the term really loosely applied there. And adding to that, you mentioned that we haven't had any real impact on economic growth. I'm not sure there's even been a lot of impact on innovation. There was this really interesting study that came out about 6 months ago, where someone used citation analysis. The author's name was Funk, to see, well, how often do how often are groundbreaking papers published? And it was a very interesting way of analyzing it. But the striking thing that he found was that if you look at groundbreaking papers from 1950 to the present, it just goes down exponentially. And so, this, of course, raises the question, what are we really getting for all this science, and why doesn't the public really see it? And of course, the third question is, are they beginning to see it?
Well, let me answer these points. First of all, those studies on return of investment in research, they're mainly associated with the name of Edwin Mansfield, who was professor at Pennsylvania. Now, he's dead, and so he can't defend himself. And so I have to be courteous in criticizing him because he's dead, and it's not fair to attack a man who can't. But those studies are deeply, deeply misleading. So what he did, Edwin Mansfield, he said, look, if you look at this university science, whatever it might be, and if you look at the way it may be commercialized in industry, it has this return on investment. But that's deeply dishonest, I'm afraid, because of all people, it was Edwin Mansfield who showed that companies do not copy science for free. If you want to copy someone else's science, you actually, the calculation can be shown very clearly, you have to invest as much in copying as you do in innovation. And the reason for that is if I come up with a discovery in biochemistry, you, unless you're a biochemist, can't copy me. If you're a nuclear physicist, you can't copy my work in biochemistry because you don't even understand the title of the paper. So the only people who copy fellow biochemists are fellow biochemists. And the price they pay to copy is the huge investment they make in their own research so that they have what's called the tacit knowledge, the capacity to read my papers. And in fact, if you look at what's actually going on in the world of science, economic science, let's say either commercial or academic, it's the same thing. You have to invest on average as much in copying as you do in innovation, because in fact, you have to be a fully skilled innovator to be able to copy other people's research. Once you put that calculation into it, you can't show any economic benefit at all on the government funding of science. And yet Mansfield, who of all people knew that, pretended otherwise. It's really quite a dishonest story, I'm afraid. The economists are fully culpable. If you look at and I'm just finishing a book on this, if you look at what the economists from Kenneth Arrow onwards write, they always assume that you can copy for nothing. That's what they assume. And they assume that because you can copy for nothing, therefore, nobody will invest in the first place because they will be disincentivized by their competitors copying for nothing. And this is repeated even to the 2020s. This is the standard dogma. And it's just not true. And what I find interesting in these reviews, some of which come from very distinguished economists, in the course of these reviews on the economics of science, they always say somewhere in the course of these reviews, of course, copying is as expensive as innovation, and it costs as much to copy as to innovate, blah, 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 blah. But they never put that together with the earlier bit. They always start with the earlier bit, saying that governments have to fund science because of the business of copying. And I'll tell you why that is, Scott. And I'll tell you why the public believes in the government funding of science. There is a complete unanimity of vested interests. Every vested interest believes in the government funding of science, so there's no debate. So the scientists believe in the government funding of science, because if they didn't work for the government in a nice, comfortable environment like a university, where they all fund each other on the basis of friendships and similar interests, they'd have to work for industry or for a foundation where they would be held accountable for what they produced. No one wants to be held accountable for what they produce. Every rational person wants to be able to do what they want without accountability. That's what peer review effectively delivers. As long as you fulfill the expectations of your chums, you continue getting funding. work for a company, you might actually produce technology that works. So the scientists believe in the government funding of science. Universities do, because half the grant is overhead. And universities have got presidents' yachts to maintain. They have other luxuries to maintain. They've got libraries and stuff. For them, government grants are fantastic. They're a source of an amazing amount of money. Industry believes in the government funding of science because it sees it as a subsidy. Actually, industry is wrong. And later on in the conversation, I'll discuss crowding out with you. But for now, this part of the conversation, let me just say, industry believes that it's getting something for its taxes when the government funds science, so they're very happy for that. The politicians like it. In the year 2000, when the human genome was first sequenced, who announced it? A couple of scientists in white coats, or President Clinton and Prime Minister Blair? President Clinton and Prime Minister Blair, who could present themselves as sort of latter-day Medicis funding Galileo. They love funding science, politicians, because the sums of money are quite modest when you consider the cost of aircraft carriers or stuff. And yet you can portray yourself as a Renaissance prince. And finally, the general public likes it because A, it believes all the propaganda, but B, the general public likes the idea of the American flag sticking on the moon, or likes the idea of these television programs showing life under the sea, PBS showing these wonderful astronomy things. And they just think this is something that the science should do. And of course, everyone believes that in health, everyone believes the government should cure them of cancer. So put all that together, and there is no voice saying that government shouldn't fund science. That's why there's a complete unanimity of opinion. There is no, you only get truth really in this world when vested interests clash.
Yeah. And of course, I think you left off the academic publishing industry, which also benefits enormously from this. I mean, I go from the time when I was a graduate student, and the principal journal in my field I could subscribe to for $25 a year, and now no one takes out individual subscriptions to journals, and it's all funded by, of course, page charges, quite enormous page charges that are assessed against grants. So again, scientists don't feel that pain. Everyone benefits, nice high profiles and things like that. But do you think the public is sort of waking up to this, that maybe we're not getting as much out of science as as the money that we're putting in? And do you think the public is waking up?
Well, the governments are. And let me tell you a dirty little secret that's never talked about. Sorry about that. That must be an email coming in. So as late as 1940, taking America is the perfect example of all this because it's also dramatic what happens. As recently as 1940, the federal and state governments together funded 23% of American research and development, a very small percentage, mainly defense and agriculture. I could go into why that is, but agriculture is just a way of subsidizing very angry farmers. It doesn't do anything useful, but it's very small. And then there's this huge conversion to the government funding of research. And as late as 1966, the federal government is funding 66% of American R&D. Today, it's only 20%. And very, very quietly, don't tell anyone, the American government has been withdrawing from the funding of research and development ever since 1966 without telling anyone because they don't want any fuss. And now they're basically just funding mission science, it's called, things that the American public absolutely wants and does not want to trust solely to the market. So half of the American federal government's funding on R&D is for defense. Well, who's going to challenge that? Of the remaining half of that is on healthcare. And who's going to stop the American government funding research into cancer or whatever? And then half of that, go carry on, is energy, where we all believe that global warming is a problem. And so that carries on. So all that mission research that is left has great popular support because everyone believes in defense and health and the environment and energy. That's fair enough. But there's a huge reduction compared to 1966, when the federal government was basically subsidizing industry. It doesn't do that anymore. Basic science. Well, the federal government gives the National Science Foundation about $8 billion a year, and it spends total on basic science of about $13 billion a year. Scott, these sums of money are tiny. For the NSF, $8 billion is a lot of money. For the scientific community, it's a lot of money. For the federal government, it's nothing. And the reason it does it is simply to keep the scientists off its back. In the 1980s, when Reagan cut science funding, the fuss, and it was bipartisan, the Wall Street Journal was as angry as the New York Times. The fuss was terrible. And so they bung $8 billion a year for the NSF, which is frankly only noise, just to keep the academic community happy. That's really why it happens. But there's no, if you talk, as I have done, to the staffers in the select committees on the Hill, in Capitol Hill in America, in Washington, D.C., they all know that there's no justification for the government funding of science, but they go along with what is a popular belief. And sometimes it's easier just to go along with a popular belief.
The statement that government is withdrawing funding from science that kind of contradicts some of the NSF's own data. You know, they publish annually an accounting of spending on higher education in colleges and universities, and I think between state and federal governments, it's actually up around 60% of the total amount of money that goes in. And of course, the National Science Foundation is one component of this, but the other big component is the growth of extramural research programs in some of these mission-oriented agencies, as you said. You know, the Department of Defense has actually, each branch of the military has its own extramural research program where they will spend money on supporting university research. And I have a funny story there. The easiest money I ever got was from actually the Department of the Army. And I worked on my area of study was social physiology of termites. And this was at about the time that they were developing autonomous combat robots. And I applied 1 year and they said, no, we're not interested. And then they called me up 2 years later and said, well, we're interested now, you know, because we want to know if we're going to equip these robots with machine guns, we want to make sure they shoot up the right people. And that money just fell in my lap, you know, and I have a feeling there's quite a bit of that goes on in the mission-oriented agencies as well. Department of Energy has its own extramural research programs. Department of the Interior does, EPA, all of those agencies. So I think that there's actually still quite a bit of money. Of course, it's minuscule compared to the rest of the federal budget, but it's enough money flowing into universities that I think has actually changed dramatically the culture of universities, which should be centered, at least Vannevar Bush argued in Science: The Endless Frontier, that the university should be havens of basic research, curiosity-driven research, not mission-oriented research. And yet what we've seen, I think, is that a lot of the new money that's coming in, that fueling that exponential growth of money spent in universities and higher education, is actually dragging universities back towards mission-oriented research, kind of in the same way that companies have tried to fund science as a kind of cheap way of having their own research and development organization. So I think what you have is this blurring and undermining of the basic role of academic science, which is to be curiosity-driven research. It's not supposed to be driven by commercial or governmental agendas. Yet there's so much money coming in that it's actually kind of converted the academies into either accessories to government science agencies or accessories to industrial research and development.
Right.
So
let me get the facts straight, because there'll be no disagreement between us. There are these two huge categories. There's research and development, which is enormous, even for the federal government. R&D is enormous. I mean, nearly 3% of GDP is R&D. And therefore, that's something like 7% of government expenditure. So that's enormous. Yeah. And then you have basic science, which is tiny. Yeah. Now, it's the R&D budget sort of collapsed since 1966, because those were going basically to companies. Basic science, of course, hasn't collapsed, although it's being dwarfed. I mean, today, if you look at, although government funding in basic science has continued to grow, you're quite right, the private funding for basic science has grown even faster. A lot of that
Hmm.
is within industry, of course. So in
Okay.
fact, the federal government is now only paying less than half for basic science in America.
Mhm.
You're quite
Mhm.
right, it has continued to go up, but it's increasingly dwarfed by what industry is funding and what the
Mhm.
foundations and universities are funding from their own funds. So we agreed on the facts because the facts are very clear.
Yes.
Changing the culture of the universities, of course. Eisenhower, in his leaving address, really lamented, famous leaving address, how the military industrial university complex had completely transformed the culture of universities. His regret wasn't that they went from curiosity-driven science to mission science, which is your current regret. His regret is they went from scholarship into judging themselves in terms of numbers of grants they won, which he thought completely undermined the purpose of the university. So to that extent, we all agreed, you being the late Eisenhower. Where you and I disagree now is on the role of basic science. I think that you're perpetuating the myth of basic science, that it should be curiosity driven, and that's of benefit ultimately to the economy. Now, there's simply no evidence that that's true. And it goes all the way back to Adam Smith, who confronted this argument, which actually goes all the way back to Francis Bacon, in fact, in the 17th century, that there's no evidence that curiosity-driven science has any economic or technological or social benefit. You may say, Scott, that if the universities are to be funded in science, then it should be curiosity-driven, because that speaks to the mission of the university. I can see that. But in fact, there are plenty of organizations that would fund that sort of thing, the foundations, the universities themselves. But the problem with what you've just said is, I would say to you, so people are moving away from curiosity-driven research, and I would say to you, so what? There's no evidence it does any good at all. Why shouldn't the universities do something that's more useful? What matters is that they expose their students to the concept of science, rather than that they engage in a fool's quest to do curiosity-driven science, but there's no evidence it's of any benefit to anyone at all. That's what I'd say to you.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's fair enough, but you're right about the university having a unique culture, and I recall a very similar debate that went on in the German universities back in the 19th century when the German research university model was being established, and it was a similar kind of argument. The Bismarck and his government was arguing that no, we need to harness German basic science to industry, and the academics resisted that because and their phrase translated from German is that no, universities should be bearers of culture. They should not be involved in fueling economic growth. And certainly I think the record supports what you were saying, namely that there's very little economic benefit that comes from funding basic research in universities. It's a value in and of itself, and of course, uh, my own opinion is that most basic research of that kind actually has very modest financial needs. Throughout my entire research career, for example, my financial needs amounted to basically buying myself a plane ticket to Southern Africa every year. Very, very modest things. And of course, you know, one of the lovely things about being in academic science is the incredible intellectual freedom that you have. And and so I think we're largely in agreement on that. I think where problems come in is that university administrators have looked upon their science faculty as this kind of resource to be developed. And so you have all kinds of academic industrial partnerships, for example, that are going to, where the company is going to fund training of students. And then there's this implicit idea that, well, you'll be giving us research that will help us provide better products. And of course, always it's the piper who gets to call the tune, and bringing in large amounts of both industrial and government funding means that you've really compromised the intellectual freedom of academic scientists to do what they want. So, do you think I'm on the right track there?
Yes, well, I mean, that, as I said, that's what Eisenhower said, but this ultimately comes back to the function of a university.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, I mean, they did in Germany see that universities were centers of research, but you've got to understand what Germany was about. Germany was much poorer than Britain, and it didn't like being poorer than Britain. And so the state was funding universities in Germany and indeed in France to catch up with Britain. And whatever the universities made, people like Humboldt may have resisted what people like Bismarck and Colbert were doing. People like Bismarck and Colbert were very clear. They were funding university science to train university scientists, to train young scientists who could go off to industry and fructify industry. They were trying to catch up with Britain. Britain, ironically, didn't bother to fund this university science because it had this great industry which was funding its own science. Thank you very much. So I think we should understand that the government funding of university science is an exercise in catching up with leaders like Britain and then later America. And really, it was a way of trying to fructify industrial science using the government's agencies, which were called universities, by which to do it. But leave universities alone, as they were left alone in Britain and America. And universities were not funding science, nor were they looking to fund science. I mean, every now and then you get Princeton creating advanced studies because a very nice donor comes along and they say, well, thank you very much. But the universities aren't competing with each other for science. And after the Second World War, when the NIH and then the NSF come along, those agencies had to go to the universities and persuade them to write grants, had to show them how to write grants, had to teach them how to write grants. The universities didn't see their role as doing science. That was seen as the role of industry. And no one doubted that industry would do it perfectly well. There was no evidence that there was any shortage of science in industry. The universities did not see that as their role. They saw their role as not so much purveyors of culture, as agents of scholarship and criticism, as agents of learning, but not as agents of doing. So we've completely shifted what the universities do. And there are consequences. I mean, the reproducibility crisis, for example, we stopped talking about it so much because now we're so used to it. But you have people like John Ioannidis pointing out in his paper, 15 years ago now, that half of all published studies are wrong. And when you get that sort of study, what you're getting is an entire ecosystem, university science, in this little ecosystem of government money coming in, scientists giving it to each other according to peer review, judging each other only by peer review, whether it's publication, whether it's grants, whether it's promotion. It's all being judged by peer review, which means if your peers believe something and you want to be promoted, published, or get a grant, you have to make sure you select the data you do select to make sure you write what your peers want to read. There's a very good man called Daniel Sarevitz, who was at Arizona State University.
Yes,
I know Daniel. Yeah, he came up with that very good saying, it's technology that keeps science honest. We live in this NSF, NIH world of peer review now, and science has become quite well known for being dishonest because peer review is not honest. It's technology that keeps science honest. And so the universities, on top of everything else that you described, are now also centers of institutional dishonesty. It's really quite a price we pay. And the real question is, what are universities doing science for in the first place? I would say to you, the natural home for science is industry. That's what happened all the way back to the last 200 years in Britain and America, the two great leading countries. It was industry that did science, or private philanthropy, Charles Darwin, privately funded. But no one thought it was the role of government, or particularly the universities. And the universities, in a sense, were better adapted to teaching and scholarship. They might have done a better job if they weren't dragged off into this further function of research.
Yeah. I mean, I try to reconcile in my mind, and of course, I'm drawing on personal experience here. Where would work like mine fit in? And there's no reason why anyone needs to know what my work is. I can just say that it was working in a very limited area of the endless frontier, looking at how termites build things and what that means for evolution and adaptation. And my financial needs, as I think I've mentioned, were actually very, very modest. But how would industry fund that? That's the question that's running through my mind.
Well, let me answer that. First of all, I've been to South Africa. I've seen those termite mounds. I know no more than anyone else, but I know as much as anyone else about the social structure of termites. I think your research is important and exciting. But if you look, I mean, let's look. If you look at the purest of science, I mean, let's consider. I come back to your. I really will consider astronomy. I mean, what could be purer than astronomy in the 19th century? There was no possible benefit of astronomy research other than its own interest. So, where did the science of radio astronomy come from? It came from Bell Labs. No one knew before Bell Labs discovered it that the stars emitted radio waves. Who discovered the microwave background radiation? Bell Labs. Who discovered that galaxies had these spiral shapes? It was the Earl of Rosse from his own funding. Who created these huge Lovell laboratory telescopes in California? Well, the name gives it away. It came out of the Lovells and the money that they raised. There's actually, it transpires, you were in Africa, you would have come across what they used to call the three women they called Leakey's trimates. Those three women who made those fantastic discoveries about gorillas and you know who I'm talking about, Jane Goodall, people like that. That was funded by a private philanthropist, because it turns out that if governments don't fund things like termite research, then philanthropists are actually looking for things to fund. People like Bill Gates do the sort of research they do in orphan diseases because the government has occupied itself with the mainstream, who in fact sequenced the human genome. Primarily, the Wellcome Trust, the world's largest charity, which was British, and industry in the form of Celera. So I say to you, yes, of course, industry is not going to fund termite research, but industry didn't fund Charles Darwin's research. What industry does, it creates wealth, and out of that wealth, either governments fund science or private individuals do. And the evidence is, and I can give you chapter and verse, is that if there's no government funding of pure science, the proliferation of private philanthropy is huge, but that gets crowded out if the government moves in and philanthropists look for other things to do. I put it to you that, like Leakey's trimates, who were funded, by the way, by a tool maker from the Midwest, who wanted to show that tool making was very ancient. I say to you that the glamour and romance of termite research, and it is glamorous and it is romantic, you'd have had philanthropists falling over themselves to fund you, but the government had crowded them out.
Yeah, and I have to admit that about half the lifetime funding of this work actually came from philanthropic foundations and outside that. So you sort of underscore your point there, and pointing to that, and this crowding out phenomenon is quite interesting because obviously people put their money where they think they're going to get the biggest bang, and as you say, if foundations think, well, we have no need to fund public science, or actually science, basic science, and yes, someone else will actually do it. But of course, what comes along with that public funding is a whole class of administrators that are suddenly empowered to do things that academics would never imagine administrators wanting to do. And one of your articles, which I've put links in the chat box to this, you mentioned, well, one of the titles is that only academics can actually be trusted to run universities. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
I would love to, but let me just say two more things quickly about my early examples. I think one thing that you omitted, if I can say that, Scott, I think one of the great 20th century discoveries was the aeroplane. And that was a straight race from the private sector and the public sector. And the Wright brothers did it with $1,000, while the Smithsonian, which had a grant of $86,000, 86 times more money, failed, and then told a series of lies. So that's very interesting. And just to come back to my example of space, who created space travel? Who funded that? That was the Carnegie Foundation funding Mooney Goddard. And that was absolutely private philanthropy. And he would have done well. There would have been satellites from Goddard, but the Second World War broke out and he was sent off to develop the bazooka instead. So there's never any example of philanthropic funding failing, actually, curiously. But you raised a very, very important point. about the governance of universities. And in England, there's been this incredible shift in the way universities are governed, caused entirely, and hugely to the detriment of universities, caused entirely by government. So in this piece that I wrote, I pointed out that the greatest universities in the world now are Oxford and Cambridge. I wouldn't have said that 20 years ago, by the way. Then it was obviously Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. What's happened in the last 20 years, as England has finally recovered from the Second World War, it takes a long time to recover from something like that, is that Oxford and Cambridge are repeatedly coming top of all the international league tables, but their income is so much less than Harvard and Yale because of the way they're funded, and yet they're beating them. And so we're very clear that the best universities in the world in terms of cost effectiveness are Oxford and Cambridge. They are the only universities in the world of any size that are run by the academics. The academics are themselves the trustees, which is perfectly legal in charity law. There is nothing in charity law to stop Harvard being run by its academics. Now, it didn't matter in Britain that essentially for historical reasons, the universities all had boards of trustees, basically because they were all initially endowed by philanthropists, and of course they would create trustees. Because before the government started funding the universities with any degree of funding, the universities didn't feel accountable to the government, and the trustees actually felt accountable to the academics, and the academics had a strong sense of autonomy, and the academics ran their universities, and the trustees were really there as a sort of long stop in case there was something going wrong and you needed someone to come. But the trustees were completely unimportant. But what's happened in recent years in Britain is the government has poured money into the universities, both for research and latterly for teaching. It's a complete revolution. And because governments are funding universities, they now demand accountability. In a sense, that's understandable. But the accountability has to come from the governing body, which is the trustees. And suddenly, trustees are now central. If you look at the British university culture, universities now essentially run by these lay external non-executive trustees. And it's a disaster. These people don't respect academic freedom. They don't respect the dignity of academics. The academic community is called a Senate, is completely removed from power. It's these lay external non-executives who now run the universities. Freedom of speech is hugely imperiled. Fun is hugely imperiled. Tenure, the quality of life, the whole thing has been taken over by these frankly ghastly people who make very bad decisions, by the way, very often. And all this is due to government interference, government funding demanding accountability. And the only universities in Britain that have survived this are Oxford and Cambridge, although the government made a really serious attempt 20 years ago to try to get the trustees to take over at Oxford, but fortunately they failed. And so the culture of universities is no longer that of academic freedom, academic empowerment, academic community. It's no longer this lovely place where academics can forge lives worth living. Academics have become employees, and the employer are these damn trustees who strut around the place as if they own the place, which of course they do. And so there's been a huge deterioration of the fun of being an academic, because in a sense, the universities have been taken away from the academics. Yeah. If you look at Harvard, Harvard nominally has trustees, but because the president of Harvard actually chairs the trustees, as he or she does at Yale, funnily enough, you still retain, Harvard is famously autonomous. The departments and faculties are famously autonomous because the president is on their side and the president can keep the trustees at bay because he or she is also their chair. But in every other American university, academics are made to feel that they're employees, not that they are co-owners. And there's been a huge impoverishment of what it means to be an academic.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience at my home university. And you mentioned fun. I decided to retire when it just wasn't fun anymore. And for the very reasons that you're outlining. This whole notion of science as a public good, that's something that's drilled into our heads from basically day one. And you have some very interesting thoughts about where that idea of science being a public good came from.
Yeah, it's a lie. And by the way, just because it's drilled in, I repeat what I've said if you went back to Egypt 4,500 years ago, you'd be told that building pyramids was a public good, because if you didn't build pyramids, the Pharaoh wouldn't go to heaven and the Nile wouldn't flood. And you were assured that was the case. 1,000 years ago in medieval France, you were assured that if you didn't dedicate your entire life to building these damn cathedrals, you would go to hell. And everyone knew that was true. We don't do that anymore. The source of the story, that science is the public good, it's an extraordinary story. And I'm afraid, and I use these words with reluctance, but I'm afraid it's a story of academic malpractice. What happened was Sputnik. What happened was the American government pouring huge sums of money, huge, into research. But the problem was they were copying the Soviet Union. And what the American government needed was some sort of academic alibi. And that was provided for them by the RAND Corporation, which stands for RAND means Research and Development, RAND. And the RAND Corporation was created in 1945 quite explicitly to lobby for the government funding of science. When Vannevar Bush discovered that despite his book, Science Ends Frontier, the American federal government wasn't going to fund science anymore, he got together with an aircraft carrier, an aircraft company rather, and the American Air Force to create this organization to lobby for the government funding of science. 1957 happened, Sputnik happened, the American government says, we're going to fund science, and then it discreetly goes to RAND and says, can you give us intellectual cover? We can't be seen to be copying Joseph Stalin. The optics aren't good. And RAND said, don't worry, we can sort this out. We will find economists who will say that free markets are best at everything except science. That's the one exception. But the Soviet Union is wrong about everything apart from science, and we can just copy that, but that's not very important. Otherwise, markets are great. And they got two very good economists, Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow. Ken Arrow won the Nobel Prize. And what these two said was this, and it's an extraordinary story which non-economists find very hard to believe, but economists find only too easy to believe. You see, there are two sorts of markets in this world. There's the market that you and I and 99.9% of people understand, which is where free markets compete with each other. And I'm trying to build a better mousetrap, and you're trying to build a better mousetrap, and I do R&D, and you do R&D, and all the rest of it. But economists also have this concept of the perfectly competitive market. Now, there's something to be said for a perfectly competitive market as an intellectual exercise. In the perfectly competitive market, there's an infinite number of consumers and an infinite number of producers and an infinite number of goods, and there is no knowledge. Knowledge is perfect. Whatever I know about how to make a better mousetrap, you do as well. And so in a perfect market, there are no real profits. Because everyone knows everything and there's an infinite number of consumers and producers, there's no profit, unlike in the real markets. But there's no research and development either, because by definition, you can't do research and development because everybody knows everything equally. So what Richard Nelson and Kenneth Arrow wrote in their papers, published in a very distinguished economics journal, was this. The perfectly competitive market is perfection, because that's what we should all aspire to. In a perfectly competitive market, you've got optimal competition, and that's good. And then they invoke something called Pareto optimality of distribution of resources. We don't need to get into that. But the point is, they stated ex cathedra, perfectly competitive markets are what we should aspire to. That's what capitalism is all about. But in perfectly competitive markets, there's no R&D by definition. Therefore, in the best possible markets, markets fail to produce R&D. Therefore, governments have to fund it. I mean, this argument is so silly and so frivolous that it just doesn't bear weight of attention for 5 minutes. But nobody knew that. Nobody outside the world of economics knew what a perfectly competitive market actually meant. When these economists were talking about market failure and perfect competition, they were thinking about their own world. They assumed, so they were completely out of their depth. The economists knew, but they also knew that if they could persuade the federal government to put money into science, then my goodness me, the universities would be flush with money, which is, of course, exactly what happened. And so it was a scam. And as part of this scam, they also came up with the theory, Nelson and Arrow, that it's very expensive to do research, but anybody can copy for nothing, which just isn't true. I repeat, only biochemists can copy the work of biochemists, and you invest in that, and that's why it doesn't cost it. And so the whole thing is a scam, but it's a scam that the economists carefully propagate to this day. And I never know what to think about it. It is huge intellectual dishonesty. It's like the bishops of Turin with their little vials of blood that they make sure liquefy when they've got the Turin shroud that they want the pilgrims to come and give their money. It's at that level of dishonesty, I think. And I think the economists know what they're up to, but there we are.
So how did these views go over with your colleagues when you were vice chancellor at Buckingham University?
Well, Buckingham was fine because Buckingham was the only university in Britain not supported by the state. We supported only by fees and endowments and things, which is why I went to Buckingham. I can tell you how they went down with the rest of the sector rather badly. I remember a friend of mine, in the 1980s, there was this real thing when Mrs. Thatcher cut. This is where I got into this. Mrs. Thatcher cut government funding in the 80s, just as Reagan did in the States, actually. And it became very fashionable for a time to declare that British science was in decline. What astonished me was I was a British scientist, and it was clearly not in decline. I was in Oxford and Newcastle for various reasons. That's not important. But both universities, I was sort of sharing my time, were struggling with the problem of too many scientists. And they were building labs like nobody's business, and they couldn't build their labs fast enough. And at the same time, these people were saying, the very same people who are complaining of crowding and not enough labs, also claiming being in decline. And when I got into this, what I discovered was this extraordinary phenomenon of crowding out. Every pound Mrs. Thatcher withdrew from the sector, the private sector was putting in £3. Every dollar Ronald Reagan was withdrawing, the private sector was putting in $3. But the scientists just didn't see it. They didn't see it because they didn't want to see it, obviously. They were just engaged in an exercise. So that's how I got into it. And I exposed this as false. And a friend of mine was talking about this because it became quite, at the time, it made a big impact. Actually, it's not true. All this propaganda was untrue. It made an impact, as you can imagine. And this friend of mine repeated what a fellow of the Royal Society, which means a very distinguished scientist in Britain, said to him. And this friend of mine told me that this FRS had said to him, this man Kealey, that's me, was very dangerous. And my friend said to this fellow of the Royal Society, yes, but no one's proven to be wrong. And this fellow of the Royal Society said, yes, and that's what makes him so dangerous. There is a consensus. And this is what this FRS said to my friend, who was a very distinguished scientist in his own right. There's a consensus that science is about honesty in everything apart from funding. And this is where the noble lie comes in. We have to engage in a noble lie so that we can ensure our funding, because we know better than the rest of the world. And we know that if you fund us, everything is better. Simply not true. I'll tell you why it's not true in a second. But once you start engaging the noble lie, then you actually, that's the thin end of the wedge, because the lies never cease to be noble. Let me tell you how crowding out is so dangerous. All the best scientists want to work for the universities. Of course they do, because every rational person wants to work without accountability. You'd be mad not to want to. And therefore, all the best scientists want to work for the universities, where you're free to do what you want within the parameters of peer review. If, therefore, the government funds these universities, which for cliche's sake I should call ivory towers, all the best universities leave industry. Therefore, industry, all the best scientists, therefore, industry is left with then second best scientists. One of the problems with second best scientists is they're not good enough to copy the best scientists. And so you get this bizarre situation. All the best scientists are in the universities doing fantastic science. Industry is left with the dregs. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I'm trying to make a point. And these are not good enough to copy the best scientists. So industry ends up with research and development that's not very good. And therefore, industry shrugs its shoulders and says, well, there's no point investing in R&D. We can't make money out of it. Let's go into marketing. And so one of the ways the government funding of science actually damages economic growth by taking the best scientists out of industry, putting them into universities, industry fails to be able to copy. The hope was, in as much as there was a hope, that industry would easily copy university science. But copying is difficult. And if your scientists aren't good, you can't copy, and that's the end of that. That's how the government funding of science and crowding out actually damages economic growth.
Fascinating. So suppose you're an academic that believes in the values that their administrators no longer support. How do you reverse this? I mean, one of the ideas that's floating around us here at the NAS is that maybe scientists should leave the university, become independent from universities, because there's so much political power, and their status has been so degraded that there's no future for them in universities anymore if they're interested in doing good science as opposed to turning the crank and churning out papers. And so
I would say to you, I'd be more positive. The world needs another Oxford and Cambridge. Or indeed Harvard and Yale. You can still see traces of, because Harvard came straight out of the Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And in the article, by the way, in an earlier article I explained how the Ivy League got captured by trustees. I say to the NAS, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, Scott, why don't we create our own university where the trustees are the academics, the scientists themselves? And let's show the rest of the sector how to run a university free of government interference, free of trustee interference, where the academics and the scholars and the researchers are the university. It won't take you long before you can show the rest of the sector how much better you are. And every academic worth their salt will want to come and join this university, and it'll become the best university in America very quickly. That's what I say to you. And afterwards, I propose we get into a little chat and see what we can do about that.
I'm fully on board with that, I have to say. So thank you, Terence. Why don't we go to the Q&A? They're starting to accumulate. Thank you all for putting in your questions. So let's go first to the Q&A group. And Daniel Lemire talks about AI, that is Chat GPT. He says, arguably one of the most important recent breakthroughs, at least in computer science, is generative AI. Do we know if this recent example tends to support or invalidate your views? I'm not sure which views we're talking about, but maybe Daniel could put something in.
Thank you, Daniel. I've just been reading it. Daniel, I'm going to be honest. I don't know. But my instinct is huge that this is industry. The AI, Chat GPT. I mean, if you look at the amount of money now that Bill Gates, all those people are spending, Zuckerman, I mean, they're spending fortunes. I mean, huge amounts of money. The NSF's budgets are completely dwarfed by those spent. I mean, dwarfed, orders of magnitude dwarfed by the amount of money that Silicon Valley is spending. I think we would have heard if AI and Chat GPT had come out of the public sector. I think we'd have heard. I'm pretty sure that's private sector. But can I just say, that's a jolly good question. I've never been asked that before. I'm very grateful that you asked that. And the next time I do a podcast somewhere, I will know the answer. So I'm very grateful to you. But I'm prepared to bet quite a lot of money that comes from industry.
Okay. So I should mention with that prompt that if you have questions that we don't get to, or you want to elaborate or explore it further, you're welcome to send questions to me at my email address. That's turner@nas.org. And I'll do my best to connect you with Terence, and you can carry on the conversation there. And just one more thing along those lines. This will be on YouTube, and of course comments there are a great place to put in questions as well, and we monitor those and try to connect whatever questions with our guest Terence. So let's go to something in the chat. We have questions coming into both the chat and the Q&A. So Dave Peterson in the chat, he mentions that his dad was a research scientist, and he would have largely agreed with your ideas. And he was making similar statements when I was a kid. And excuse me, I think this illustrates kind of a generational change that we're seeing. My impression was that for about 2 generations after World War II, when you still had scientists who were steeped in this traditional viewpoint of what the universities should be about, they managed to carry those values over about 2 generations. But demographics being what it is, those generations change. You have new people coming up who grow up and mature in an entirely different science ecosystem. So do you think that this I know that university administrators have their own share of blame, but part of it is that, well, one of the surprising things to me is how almost uninterested fellow academics are to these kinds of ideas. I mean, you still find very good curiosity-driven scientists in universities, but there seem to be a lot who really have bought into this idea that, well, the only way we can do science is to get money from the government, and with all the things that go along with that. They gear their activities towards publications, never mind how good they are, pursuing H indices and those kinds of things. And I don't know, it might just me being an old fogey, but it seems that the new faculty that we hired towards the end of my career were very different in character and motivation from the ones that I went to graduate school with. Do you think that's
Yeah.
that
Yes, I
there's a
do.
case
By
to
the
be
way,
made there?
when I was swapped, can you see me still?
Yes.
Yes, well, I'm going to press, because I can't see you. I'm just going to press this button because I had to, as I went from the chat. So I hope I'm not going to disappear.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I still see you. You can also break out the chat box from the
Yes,
regular screen.
I don't know why heavens. Well, you can see me, so I'm going to answer this. It's very annoying that I
Yeah, we
can't
can see you. Yeah.
I don't know what I've done wrong here. So I don't want to do that. Cancel. I don't want to leave the webinar. Okay, so here we are. I bet. That's a very, very good question. There's absolutely no question at all. First of all, that is a very good point. And that there's no question at all that the quality of faculty is completely different. Oh, it's done that again. There's something wrong with my thing. Let me tell you a story to illustrate the point that you're making. At the University of Buckingham, where I was, there was a custom that I had with one of my colleagues, is that every Monday at 6:30 in the evening, I would run a journal club for any student who wanted to turn up. We would read The Economist together, like a scientific journal club. And the only entry you had to have was a copy of The Economist, a hard copy, so that we would all discuss it. And I would do this it's a small university, but we get a significant number of students. And of course, they loved meeting the president every week, and they loved the fact that the president was teaching them every week and all that sort of thing. But sometimes I couldn't come, of course, because presidents have jobs to do. And sometimes I had a deputy who stood in for me. But once in the course of about 11 years, neither I nor my deputy could do it. And there was a young person who joined the university, claimed to be absolutely in agreement with the feelings of the university, the culture of the university. And I went to see him one day. He'd only been there for a few months. I said, look, I'm really sorry, but neither I nor this friend of mine can do it. Could you next Monday at 6:30 run the Economist Club? And he was offended. He was genuinely offended. He said, I'm here to work 9 to 5. I'm not here to work after 5:30. You have insulted me. It was a completely different culture. So yes, you're absolutely right. What has happened is a huge selfishness has come into the whole system, where it's all about you being judged against metrics. And no one is asking, are these metrics themselves of value? I mean, are the grants that you win of value to society? The question is, do the grants that you win, are they of value to you in your career? There has been a huge reorientation of the universities from public service and communitarian service to the individual promoting their own career. And this is because people are rational and they respond rationally to incentives. 100 years ago, the incentive was to be a good member of the Physiological Society or the Biochemical Society or the university, whatever. Now the incentive is only how many grants you're getting, how many papers you're publishing, can you get promoted, what's your salary. The whole culture is simply no more about public service, about the community. It's all about you and your progress. People have responded to that, and the culture has changed the individual and vice versa. So you're absolutely right. Is it a loss? It's a huge loss. And it's a huge loss because, ironically, that is not the culture of industry, ironically. We have taken science away from industry and we put it into the universities. But in industry, teamwork is really important. Industry has its faults. I mean, I'm not pretending industry is perfect, but the one thing industry is about teamwork. You know, we hear jokes about people going off in teamwork. And what's happening in the universities is not about teamwork. We're making people much more selfish. So yes, you're absolutely right. And it's a consequence of the way the grant system comes. And now I'm going to see if I can get my picture up again.
I've heard that very same thing from
I'm
senior colleagues at other universities, and I had an interesting experience when I was a faculty member. We were affiliated. We're a state university, and we were affiliated with a large private university, but at the same time, I was involved in reassessing the criteria for tenure. And the private university at this time, their conception of tenure was, how do we judge someone's willingness to continue to take intellectual risks? Meanwhile, at the public university where I was, it was all focused on building a matrix of papers published, students trained, what your evaluation scores were. And it just struck me as such an incredible contrast between institutional cultures, and the willingness to take risks did not enter into the private universities thing. So again, you have this kind of careerist mentality versus a kind of idealistic mentality of what the university should be. And it was rare then. It's rare enough to be surprising to me, but it's almost now universal, I think. So let's go back to the Q&A. I'm looking at Jack Budney's comment. Have you explored what influence government funding has had on how the scientific process has been influenced and or changed? I think we've covered that quite a bit, but do you have anything that you care to add to that, Terence?
No, I mean, I think I go back to the point that peer review now dominates, where before it was much more about technology testing and about teaching. No, I think we've covered all this. I think government funding has had a very bad effect on the scientific process. But for all the reasons we've discussed, and since there's so many other questions, I'll simply say it's a good question, but I think we've covered it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jack Budney asked a second question, follow-up question. He draws this interesting distinction between centralization, which he equates with pure science, and decentralization, which he equates with applied science. And he wonders, how would you respond to the position that the role of government funding should be for pure research and industry should be for applied research? I'm getting the impression that you don't think it's such a distinct.
I mean, the distinction goes all the way back to Francis Bacon in 1605. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a long, long way back. And what Francis Bacon was trying to do 400 years ago, an English lawyer, a very ambitious politician. England then, London especially, was a ferment of creativity. There's a Californian academic called Deborah Harkness who wrote a book called The Jewel House, and it's about England, London, about 1600. And it's as I said, it's a ferment of creativity. And Francis Bacon goes to King James and says, look, give me some money, I can create a foundation and I can create an agency and we can do even better. And King James says, go away. We don't need government funding. It's doing so well. The English Industrial Revolution is happening very well, thank you, without government funding for science. But Francis Bacon invents this idea of pure science. It's actually an invention he came up with. And he got it. I'll tell you where that idea came from. He got that from looking at the Portuguese voyages of discovery. He claimed, falsely, we know it's untrue because we can test it empirically, that Henry the Navigator had a pure science lab at Sagres in Portugal. Out of this pure science came advances that the Portuguese used to discover the world, and the Spanish then used to discover America. And it's simply not true. Francis Bacon's story is simply based on a myth for various reasons. It's simply not true. And indeed, no one has ever shown that governments should fund pure science, because without it, you don't get technology, you don't get economic growth. So I say to you that the very fundamental principles of your question are based on a myth that 99% of people believe. There's no way that you should in any way feel that that was not an intelligent question because of what you're fed, the way we're all fed. But the reality is, it's a myth that's created by those who are trying to create government funding for science that the market wouldn't fund. They're basically rent seekers. They're literally rent seekers. And the trouble with that story is it's never been shown to be true, and it's been disproved 100 times. We don't need separate government funding for science. The market and philanthropists together cover it totally. That's my answer to that.
Yeah, amazing. So back to the Q&A. Karen Sigemund is wondering where do the Max Planck Institutes fit into this academy industry divide of scientific research, including, she says, as regards government funding, value of outcome, and so forth. So we all know the Max Planck Institutes, what kind of prestigious work they do there. How does that fit into the scheme?
Well, I mean, do Max Planck Institutes do good science? Of course they do. No one's going to say they don't do good science. But the question is, what's the price we pay? What have we lost? Those scientists will still be being funded, but they're either in the universities or they would be in industry. I think it's important to understand, I'm just repeating myself, where the Max Planck Institutes come from. They come from the German government. Originally, of course, they weren't called that. They were named after Kaisers and things. Right. Catching up with in England and then America, and the government trying to help that catch-up process. I would compare Max Planck Institute, and I'm sorry, but I am just repeating myself, so it's very boring, to one of those beautiful French cathedrals or one of those beautiful Egyptian pyramids. They're great, they're beautiful, they do exactly what they're designed to do, and they do it to a very high standard, but do you actually need them? And I would say to you that there's a price you pay for Max Planck Institute, which is you're taking scientists away from industry, you take the scientists away from universities. So it's a reflection of German culture. I think if you could imagine an alternative universe in which they didn't exist, I don't think the world would have been any different and might actually be better. You might get better quality teachers in universities, and you'd certainly get better quality scientists in industry. And can I just say that the next question comes from an old friend of mine.
Are you talking about Randy or Bernard?
Bernard.
Yeah, yes, okay. I was just going to mention Randy very quickly about just to convey his comment that you're convincing me of the value of philanthropic funding over government funding as a way of returning to curiosity-driven science from bureaucracy-driven science. And that's just, Randy Wayne is a friend of ours, and thank you, Randy, for that comment. But let's go to the Bernard Trout question. That's quite extensive. So you've read it. Let me just briefly familiarize myself with his comment. Left out the utter pernicious consequences of government-funded science that now Marxist political statements are required to get science university positions and to get government funding. I think Bernard is referring to this requirement that you swear allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion values, even to get your applications to university position considered. And he goes on to say that various kinds of stratagems like speech squelching administrative organizations, I think that we're all in agreement with that, leaving scientists in fear of any misinterpreted statement or even standing out for classical liberal ideals. This seems to be worse than the economic consequences, but it's related to the educational consequences, as students have to toe the party line to have any chance of a job. The captive mind. Your thoughts?
It's a brilliant question, and of course, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The only answer I would give that is optimistic is what's happened in Britain. And I don't say that because I've suddenly become an inward-looking provincial person. But the universities that have put up the greatest resistance to everything you described are Cambridge and Oxford in that order. So at Cambridge, the president recently had to go early. He had to leave because the university simply refused his woke agenda. He tried to get through exactly what you described, that we had to decolonize the maths curriculum, whatever that means, and all the rest that you have described. And the academics said no, because most academics are perfectly sensible people. And there were 2 votes. The governing body of the University of Cambridge has something like, you may find this hard to believe, the governing body of the University of Cambridge is something like 2,500 folk. Every tenured professor at Oxford and Cambridge is a trustee. And so what happened, there's a particular individual, a marvelous man in one of the colleges, he got together a group of people and they put out a motion. We went to the University Parliament, which is called Regent's House, and there was a vote. And we voted, or I'm no longer at Cambridge, they voted, no, we're not going to go down this route of requiring these statements. And it was just reversed. And then the university administration had another go, and there was another vote, And again, the woke agenda was ruled out. And in the end, the university president had to go. So if there's academic democracy, you can kill this. And curiously, the University of Cambridge was able to look the government out. The government, of course, wants to fund the University of Cambridge because there's some universities so good that governments don't want to lose the ability to put funding in those. So the governments had to step back, and everyone's had to step back because this democratic body at Cambridge has said no. And in Oxford too, there's a man called Rhodes, as in Rhodesia, Rhodes, the great imperialist. And there's a statue of him in one of the colleges, and everyone wants to knock it down. And the college has said, no, we're not going to do it. What are you going to do about it? So the answer to all this is academic democracy. Most academics are sensible people, but most trustees are not. Trustees don't have any skin in the game. They don't care if academics have to go through ridiculous rigmarole. They just go home that night, lead the normal life. So it's the trustees who surrender immediately to every passing fad, and it's the administrators who get their power from the trustees. So the rest of the sector is in trouble because trustees are, in a corporate sense cowards, frankly, and they're not going to stand up. If you want to stand up for this, it's a very good question. We need academic democracy. Let no one forget the early universities, Bologna, Padua, Montpellier, these were all democracies. The universities were created by the students, funnily enough, as democracies, as guilds to fund the teachers. And then the next generation of academics of universities, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, were created and funded by the scholars as democracies. Only later was democracy destroyed. And I say to you, very good question. If we're going to get sense and sensibility back into the universities, they have to revert to being academic democracies. And there are such examples. Actually, it's more than just Oxford and Cambridge, actually. If you look at Britain, there's the Architectural Association School of Architecture, 150 years old now, one of the best architectural schools in the world. Almost every architect you've heard of trained there. And it's a democracy, half alumni, half teachers. And there are other examples as well, Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. We need to create some academic democracies. And after this, I'm looking forward to my friend Scott Turner and I getting together to plot a new university run by the academics where we can tell the administrators to get back in their box.
Well, I'm completely on board with that. But, absolutely, I did spend some sabbatical at Cambridge once and saw a little bit about the governance, but I'm just curious about one specific example. As you know, University College London went through this spasm to cancel Thomas Huxley of all people because he'd said some apparently non-politically correct things. Where does University College London fit on this thing? Are they governed by an external body of trustees, or are the trustees the academics there themselves?
No, external trustees.
External.
It's only Oxford, Cambridge, the Architectural Association School of Architecture in Britain. Yeah. And then in Ireland, funnily enough, you've got Trinity College Dublin and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. So it's rather unusual that they should have so many independent organizations. But UCL, like every other body, is run by trustees.
Yeah.
Even Buckingham is, and Buckingham has done badly because of its trustees. Buckingham would be a much better university if it wasn't for the trustees. So even Buckingham has suffered that.
Yeah. Okay, I think we will wrap up here with a comment from George Lee in the chat. Says, I find your idea very appealing, but I must say that a lot of basic research in quotes you quoted as coming from Bell Labs was only possible because one, AT&T was a monopoly, and to protect its monopoly status, it thought it was good PR to show it was supporting the public good. I would just add to this that one of the things about Bell Labs is that they weren't really very tight-fisted with their patents. But the point is taken, that was possible because they made money otherwise. And then the second question is that he says that Bell Labs basically ran a revolving door system with universities, and I'm thinking of William Shockley here as the prime example, and would not likely have been able to recruit first-rate researchers without university also doing state-funded research. course, the thing that belies that is, of course, is that a lot of this basic research was done prior to World War II, when this expansion of state-funded work was done. But he says, I do like your proposal, but I hope there are ways to address my doubts. So money is tied up into it in every instance, and yet Bell Labs actually was an amazing laboratory of new ideas, with transistors sitting at the top. And I think he's getting it. What's the morality of having a monopoly fund your research?
Yeah, it's a very good question, of course. But what is premised is that because there were universities there, Bell Labs naturally took advantage of them. The question is, what would have happened if those universities were not there? What would Bell Labs have done? Well, I think it would have been like Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison didn't work very closely with universities. Of course, he was very keen on patents. He held over 1,000 patents. But he discovered the thermoionic effect. He did good work together with Tesla. They were competitors. But together with Tesla, Edison and Tesla did some amazing science as well as technology. So what I'm saying to you is, yes, Bell Labs has a monopoly. Monopolies are not themselves bad. If your monopoly is because you are constantly coming up with the next first mover advantage, that monopoly is earned. And of course, you're terrified that you'll lose your monopoly, so you carry on doing R&D to maintain your monopoly. That's very different from the sort of monopoly where you can prevent entry. In a good market, you can't prevent entry, and your monopoly comes simply because you keep on developing the better product. Yeah. Yes, Bell Labs use the universities because the universities are there, and that's what industry does. It takes advantage of every opportunity. But I would propose, and you've only got to look at 19th century America to show that that appears to be the case, I propose that if those state-funded universities were not there, the scientists would have, in fact, probably been at Bell Labs in the first place, and industry would have simply become more competitive. So later on, you see, there's another question about Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC, I want to tell the story of Xerox PARC before we go, Scott, because it's such an interesting story. Everyone points to Xerox PARC. It comes back to the Bell question. Everyone talks to Xerox PARC as the triumph of the private sector. Oh, no, it wasn't. Xerox PARC exists because of Senator Mansfield. Senator Mansfield was the senator who ran the Senate. I can never remember the official, but he was the leader of the majority party in the Senate. So he ran the Senate for about 25 years, a very powerful man. And in 1969, there was a very interesting report. At the end of the Vietnam War, there was real concern, was this government funding of science getting any value or not? And this report came out in 1969, which showed that of 700 research events that the American army had exploited for its weapons, only 2 had come from basic science. And therefore, Senator Mansfield judged that ARPA, now DARPA, was a waste of money because it wasn't delivering. And so in 1970, and then 2 or 3 years later, he slashed DARPA's pure science funding completely. And all those scientists were made redundant in the early 70s. The story is now completely forgotten. And he was blamed at the time for destroying American science. What did all those scientists do? They were working actually on basically what we would now call personal computers, the interface, and mice and all that sort of thing. They were working on that in DARPA, but they weren't doing anything with it. They were just doing it as an exercise. They all went to Xerox PARC, who employed all these people, and it was run by a former DARPA person as well. And suddenly these DARPA employees, after they'd been sacked from the government and were forced to work in industry, suddenly produced the modern world. But they produced the modern world because they'd been sacked from government and sent to industry. And that's where they did it. And I would say to you, it's only because in industry that they're working that we have the modern world. I think the Xerox PARC story illustrates that.
Yeah. Of course, the interesting thing there is that they were led by a scientist, not by an administrator, from what you said. So,
absolutely led by scientists.
Yeah. So we've reached the end of our time here. Thank you, Terence. I'm going to give you the last word in a moment. Just a bit more housekeeping here. Again, let me just reiterate that if we're not able to get to all these questions today, please do send them along to my email at turner@nas.org. And I'll just mention again that today's webinar is going to be available on YouTube to you very soon, and those links will be shared with you. And you can add comments there as well, and we do monitor them to see what things we come up with. And finally, I'd like to put in a little bit of plug for 2 more NAS webinars this week. I've put links to them in the chat box. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., we have an American Innovation webinar, one of our series, and that will feature John Bainbridge and Ashish Levinsky, who will be talking about the taming of the West and the role of the revolver in that. And then on Friday, we'll have another Restoring the Sciences webinar, and our guest this time will be the eminent climate realist, as I call her, Judith Curry, and she'll be discussing rethinking climate risk. And one interesting thing about this is that one of our members will be guest hosting along with me then, and that's Friday at 3. And as I mentioned, I've put links into the chat box, so please copy them right away. And Terence, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. We are going to be in touch with you definitely about practical ways to move this world to recover the sciences. And I will give you the last word.
Well, I'm not going to reiterate what I've said. The questions were great. Uniformly, the questions were great. Some of them were new to me, so I was very doubly grateful. I would just want to add, the last comment you made was Xerox PARC was run by a scientist. I think the one thing the venture capital revolution has shown is that scientists can run companies. We forget what the venture capital revolution did. It took scientists away from their inferiority complexes and shown that scientists can run companies very successfully. Scientists are great. They're the best people in the world. We should break away and run our own institutions. And we don't need government, by the way. We can make a lot of money in the private sector ourselves. Scientists of the world unite, break your chains. We can do it in the private sector, both in our own universities away from trustees and in our companies away from government funding.
Hear, hear. If only we had an anthem for that, that would be great. So Terence, again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank all of you for coming to today's webinar. It was a fun, fascinating discussion. Terence, thanks again very much. And as I say, we'll be in touch. Okay.
Thank you very much.